Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily. Today is Thursday, December 5th, 2024. On today's episode of the show, we're going to gather around the virtual water cooler and talk about what we've been watching. My name is Ben Pearson. I am an editor at slashfilm.com, and I'm joined on today's episode by Slash Film editor Jacob Hall.
Hello, hello.
All right, Jacob, before we get into what we've been watching, let's get into what we've been reading. What have you been reading recently?
I have a lot of things to talk about. And in fact, I cut this list in like half. I've been reading a lot since we spoke, Ben. But I'll talk to stuff that I think will be of most interest to our readers, starting with The Future Was Now by Chris Nashawaty. This is the second one of his books I've read. He wrote a book about the making of Caddyshack a little while back that I found really interesting. And this book is about the genre films that were released in 1982. And if you're not familiar with the summer of 1982, within like 2 months of each other, it was E.T., Tron, Star Trek II, Conan the Barbarian, Blade Runner, Poltergeist, The Thing, and Mad Max the Road Warrior. So like just the seismic summer of movies that had a massive impact either immediately or down the road. And if you already know the basics of these movies, this book is not going to have a ton of information that's new to you. But this is very much like a 101 survey on the summer of 1982. And I found it useful and refreshing and liked seeing all the stories put in one place. The stuff that was newest to me was learning the full details about just how badly The Thing bombed and just how badly The Thing nearly tanked John Carpenter's career, which is so interesting because, 40 years later, it is considered a masterpiece. Now, at the time, it literally led to John Carpenter being removed from his office on the Universal lot.
Wow.
But yeah, so if you, like I said, if you don't know anything about the making of these movies or unfamiliar with the summer of '82, this book is a treasure trove. If you already know your stuff, it's just a fun read. Ben, I'm curious. How familiar are you with the legendary summer of '82 and all these movies?
I mean, I guess I've absorbed a lot of that information, but yeah, I've never seen it all laid out in one sort of master timeline or anything. It just seems like, yeah, talking about, I guess the title of the book, "The Future Was Now," is it titled that because those movies have had such a long tail, and almost all of those things that you mentioned are basically franchises that continue into today?
Yeah, that seems to be the implication of the title, and also just the idea that uh, the Hollywood studio system's sudden reliance on genre filmmaking was really born in that year, because it took them 5 years to properly react to Star Wars. It took 5 years for them to start saying, okay, are people okay with fantasy? Are people okay with science fiction? Because before Star Wars, that was nothing that drove box office, nothing that filled theaters. It was considered kind of cheap and junky. So this was the summer where like the next 4 decades were born. And it's funny,
Yeah.
because E.T. was such a giant, massive hit. Star Trek 2 was a hit. But like Conan Barbarian was only a minor hit. Blade Runner was a bomb. The Thing was a bomb. It just all these films that were massive deals, massive deals now weren't successes, critical or financial back then. So it's just this really interesting year where so many people got it wrong. Like you read some of the reactions to The Thing, and you go, "Wow!" It's staggering to learn that, I don't know, like Carpenter was being courted as being the next Spielberg. He was going to be the guy who lived on Universal lot and had offices there and get all the A pictures brought to him, and then just it's kind of unreal reading some of this. But at the same time, like I said, a lot of these books have inspired their own book. Sorry, a lot of these movies have inspired their own book. Like Star Trek 2 has its own books about it. You can find entire books about Blade Runner, entire books about The Thing. So if you want like a deep study into the making of these films, the stuff is out there. But if you want, like I said, the Survey 101 version of it, this is I would recommend this to most people listening to this podcast.
Awesome. Okay, so that's called The Future Was Now. What else have you been reading?
Another book that kind of an interesting companion piece to that one. It's called Shock Value by Jason Zinoman. It covers the period, let's say, between Rosemary's Baby and Night of the Living Dead, all the way up to Alien and Halloween. So that decade of where horror movies, started being a little more, having a harder edge, started being nastier, started being more grounded in reality, and it's a really good read. And I think the Wes Craven chapters in particular about his early exploitation career prior to Nightmare on Elm Street are really valuable, and I learned a lot from those. But similarly to The Future Was Now, if you already know a whole lot about these individual movies, this book is, not surface level, but definitely doesn't dig as deep as you may want it to on specific subjects because it has so much ground to cover. Also, I will say that Zinoman, while certainly a good writer, occasionally has some opinions that made me scratch my head. So as a historian, he's fine, but as a film analyst and critic, there are points in it where I started thinking, do you like horror movies? So, but it's still a good read. I think also it's very, very funny that this book overlaps with The Future Was Now, and that they both discuss John Carpenter, Ridley Scott, and Dan O'Bannon, who was John Carpenter's old college friend who ended up writing the first drafts of Alien before Ridley Scott, essentially kicked him off that set. And The Future Was Now has first-hand reporting directly from John Carpenter, where it comes off that John Carpenter is super reasonable, and Dan O'Bannon was a maniac who made everybody uncomfortable. But then you read Shock Value, which has first-hand reporting from Dan O'Bannon, who passed away shortly after this book was published, but not from John Carpenter. And that book, Dan O'Bannon is passionate but reasonable, and John Carpenter is an icy, unfeeling bad friend. So I thought it was very funny to read them back to back because they literally tell opposite sides of the story based on who they had first-hand interviews with.
Interesting. Okay, so that's called Shock Value. What's the next one you read?
Okay, very famous book, very beloved. Finally got around to it. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. This was published 20 years ago. Its 20th anniversary was this year, which is why I was encouraged to pick it up and give it a read finally. And Ben, when you read a book and you're nearing the end of it and you realize if this sticks to landing, is like a top 10 book of all time for me.
Oh man, such a great feeling.
Yeah, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is a top 10 of all time for me. If you are not familiar with it, this is it's a book set in alternate history, United Kingdom in the early 1800s against a backdrop of the Napoleonic Wars. And the basic gist is that history is essentially 95% the same, I'd say, as it is in our world, except that magic exists and it's gone out of fashion in England, and people know that magic exists and people can use magic, and there are people who study magic, but it's not necessarily treated as something that is important or at the forefront of people's minds. And it's about two magicians, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, the title, who essentially emerge to bring English magic back into fashion. And it's about them getting involved in the society of the times, getting involved in the Napoleonic Wars, and about how society reacts to the reintroduction of magic in the same way that somebody would react to a new science being discovered, or somebody bringing up a philosophy that changes the culture of an entire nation. And the magic is presented as being really mysterious and wild. Like, nobody's throwing fireballs at each other. Nobody is, waving magic wands. This is not Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings magic. It's just very... It feels very... When magic happens on screen in the book, it feels very special and sometimes very scary and very monumental. A lot of the fantasy elements actually happen off screen, so to speak. And a lot of the book is people talking about magic instead of performing magic. And that may be a turn off for people who want a more traditional fantasy epic. But Susanna Clarke is writing this in the same style as like a Jane Austen book or a Charles Dickens novel. It has that sort of old school style of the time. And it genuinely feels like a strange artifact ripped from a different time period where this was actually the truth in a lot of weird ways. And it's a long read. It's about 1,000 pages. And I'd say about 300 pages of it is plot. And the other 100 pages is letting you exist in this world and absorb its textures and its characters and how it feels to be there. And if you want like super plot driven stuff, that's totally A-okay. But I found myself so lost in this and enjoying it so much. And Clarke was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome, and she can't write very much anymore. And she had to cancel a sequel of this book because she literally does not have the physical energy to research and write a book of this size again. And on one level, it's tragic, but on another level, it just allows this one book to exist and be kind of perfect. So if you're one of the people who, like me, who saw this book on shelves for 20 years and never picked it up, now is the time. This is one of the best books I've ever read.
Wow. Okay. That's a very, very strong recommendation for Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Let's see. You got a couple other ones you wanted to talk about too, right?
Yeah, I'll talk about another book that is the complete opposite of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, a sci-fi fantasy book called Gideon the Ninth. And I want to pull this up because it has the single best front cover quote I've ever seen on a book. Like if you hear this quote, you immediately know whether or not you are going to want to read this or not. Okay, so here's what's written on the cover, credited to author Charles Stross. Speaking of the book, lesbian necromancers explore a haunted Gothic palace in space. Decadent nobles vie to serve the deathless emperor. Skeletons.
So this sounds, my wife has this book because she was trying to figure out what she should read next. And I was like scrolling through titles in our library that were unfamiliar to me. And I read that very thing. And I was like, how is this not the next book that you're reading? Because that description sounds amazing. So yeah, what did you think about this? I have not read this yet myself.
This book is incredibly fun. It is a horror tinge, dark fantasy sci-fi. Essentially, the short version of the plot is the main character, Gideon the Ninth, is the bodyguard of this Gothic necromancer space house. So, like, if imagine like the houses of Dune or Game of Thrones, but everybody uses death magic and they live in space. And she's the bodyguard of the noble daughter of the house who runs everything, and they're essentially summoned to the Grand Imperial Palace for reasons I'll leave unspoiled here, and all kinds of freaky science fiction, fantasy, horror stuff happens. The action is really well written. Tamsyn Muir, the author, she has a really, really keen like eye and ear for action. So like, there's a lot of sword fights, and they're all really good. But perhaps most surprisingly is for a book that's so full of like death and violence and like really hardcore sci-fi fantasy, it's really, really funny. Like the first person narration from Gideon is extremely hilarious. She's essentially this late teens asshole lesbian who does not want to be there. And the tone reminded me a lot, Ben, of the Dungeons and Dragons Honor Among Thieves movie. How that
Oh,
movie
yeah.
managed to be really, really funny without like undervaluing its adventure, and it sort of has that tone. Or even more accurately, perhaps Thor Ragnarok is another one that reminded me of, where it's really funny without losing a sense of drama and action. And it makes sense because Tamsyn Muir is from New Zealand, like Taika Waititi is. And I think like if you found Thor Ragnarok or Wood in the Shadows funny, then this has a very similar sense of humor. So Gideon the Ninth, lots of fun. Maybe not to all taste because it is kind of grisly and kind of dark, but I had an awesome time with this one.
Yeah, I mean, I find it hard to believe that anybody's going to have like a better front of the book description kind of thing than what appears on that one. So, this next book that you're about to talk about, Jacob, I was like, this sounds super familiar to me. Why does it sound familiar? And the answer is I put it on my Christmas list, and I was like, why did I do that? And the reason is you told me about this on Slack already, so you just haven't talked about it on the podcast yet. So tell me about this next one.
Yeah, I want to talk about this one because I read this and I said, man, this is a book that if anyone's going to like this book, it's Ben Pearson. But I think it also has a very cinematic concept. And I was actually dismayed to learn that Netflix was going to adapt this into a miniseries and dropped it a few years ago. I still think there's a big opportunity there. But this is The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. And this is a Agatha Christie style murder mystery about a death at a English manor in the woods in the 1920s. There's a party happening. So there's dozens of suspects. You know, the servants, the guests, the family, and the main character has to solve it because he's in a time loop, and every single day he wakes up, he's in a different body of a different person at the house. So it's a bit of Quantum Leap, a bit of Groundhog Day, a bit of Edge of Tomorrow. It has a lot of bits and pieces from a lot of time loop movies and stories you've seen before, but it also really plays out like an old school mystery, like, you know, a whodunit. And I'd say maybe about 80%, you know, locked room, wandering around the manor, solving things, mystery, about 20% science fiction. If you're looking for like a straight up sci-fi time loop story, this isn't it. But if you're looking for a time loop story that powers, you know, a mystery in a really unique way, this is a really fun read. Maybe not as like profoundly good as Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, but in terms of I don't want to stop reading this thriller, 7.5 Deaths of the Hardcastle is very fun. And I feel like if you're a slash film reader / listener, it's the kind of high concept that I think will perk up even someone who's a bit jaded at this point.
Yeah, this sounds like it absolutely rules. I can't wait to get my hands on this. Stuart Turton is the author, and The Seven and a Half Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle is the name of the book. All right, Jacob, let's take a break and then we'll come back and get into what we've been watching. So, Severance season 2 is coming up in January. I think it's like January 14th or something, middle of the month. And I was kind of like, I'm really looking forward to the show, Jacob, because I loved Severance season 1. But I realized that it's been so long that there are definitely going to be things that I just don't remember from the first season. And like, of course, I remember the broad strokes of the show, and that finale in particular of Severance season 1 is like one of the best finale episodes I've ever seen, maybe one of the best TV episodes full stop I've ever seen. But I remembered there being, some stuff with the goats and like a few little lore items that I was like, you know what, they're probably going to reference some of this stuff and I should probably just rewatch Severance season 1. And I absolutely don't have time to be doing this because this is the time of year where like we have all the awards screeners and end of the year stuff that we have to do, and like everything is just sort of slamming together in one massive timeline and like everything is backing up on each other. But I made time and I carved out time to rewatch Severance season 1. And going into this, I was kind of like, man, I know enough of this. This is just going to be like me doing this for work and me not actually getting much enjoyment out of it. And I was shocked to discover that I just had such a blast rewatching the show. It's so good. I think all of this is to say the quality of Severance so far has been so amazing that it can overcome my sort of begrudging negative attitude going into it. And it just made me like a super fan of the show all over again. So I realize it's a tough ask for people, and I would and actually was. I would normally be, and actually was in this case, very annoyed at the suggestion of rewatching a whole season of television before another season came around, especially since like it's not my fault that it took 2 years or almost 3 years for the show to come out. Like, why should I have to rewatch it? But I will just say that I got such an intense level of enjoyment and appreciation out of rewatching this show, and I'm very excited to see what they do with season 2. So I don't know, what's your take on Severance and where does that sit for you? Are you excited about season 2? Are you kind of dreading it? Where are you right now?
I mean, I'm excited, but it has been nearly 3 years, as you said. So I probably need to rewatch it as well. But that first season is truly incredible. And I remember first having it described to me, and my first thought was, how it's just a TV show. I don't know how it sustains itself across even one season of TV. And then it does. And it's so funny and strange. And it gave me it gave me season 1 of Lost vibes, which is a high I've been chasing, for 20 years. Like lots of shows have attempted to like get me truly engaged in a mystery, a sci-fi mystery. And most of them, if they succeed, it's a mild success. I'm like, okay, I'll like obsessive about it. Whereas I felt obsessive about Severance season 1. And that finale is one of the all-time TV cliffhangers. I've been waiting for so long to see what happens next. So yeah, I feel like suggesting people rewatch 8 episodes 3 years after the fact is not, I don't think it's as extreme as you're thinking, because as somebody who used to rewatch all of Game of Thrones up to that point before every new season, I feel like some people will appreciate revisiting this show. I know I'm going to be looking forward to revisiting it later this month.
Yeah, definitely. And most of the episodes are like around the 45-minute mark or something like that. So it's not like you're investing, 9 full hours into a rewatch or anything. So, yeah, anyway, just great stuff. That's on Apple TV Plus if you want to check that out. Jacob, I also was recently sent the Alfred Hitchcock Iconic Film Collection, which is a new series of 4K restorations of, I think it's 6 Alfred Hitchcock movies. So you got Rear Window, To Catch a Thief, Vertigo, North by Northwest, Psycho, and The Birds, all in 4K in this gorgeous package that I really think if there's an Alfred Hitchcock fan in your life that appreciates physical media and doesn't already own these movies, this is like a perfect Christmas present idea. Jacob, are you familiar with the artist Tristan Eaton? I know you kind of tap into the art stuff here and there, especially with like Mondo and that whole world.
No,
Do you recognize that name?
I followed the world a little bit over the past few years due to just life stuff. So I can't say I'm familiar with Tristan Eaton.
Okay. Yeah, Tristan Eaton, I guess, designed or created the artwork for this thing, and I think you might recognize the artist's style if you see the cover of this. And the interesting thing about this set is that these movies come packaged inside a literal book about Alfred Hitchcock. It's very short. It's only 30 pages or something like that, but it's basically like a beautiful, oversized coffee table style book that has this incredible artwork on it, and sort of behind the scenes little trivia and stuff like that about each of these movies, and some big scale stories about Hitchcock's upbringing, and sort of like that famous story of him getting locked in a jail by his father when he was really young, and that basically forming the foundation of his mistrust of authority and things like that, and that sort of like wrong man accused idea that runs throughout so many of his movies. So there's like some biographical stuff in there too. But I rewatched Vertigo last night in for the first time in, God, I mean, it must have been 20 years or something. And I realized, having rewatched this movie, that I just straight up did not understand the film the first time that I watched it. Like, I didn't realize that I guess spoilers for Vertigo now, but Kim Novak's character seems to disappear at one point in the movie, and and she's this classic sort of Hitchcock blonde figure, and then a version of her who looks similar but is a brunette comes in, I don't know, at the halfway mark or a little bit later into the movie. And I remember distinctly thinking when I was a kid watching this that, like, oh, that's a different actress. And so that completely changes the meaning of the movie, because in fact, it is not a different actress. It actually is Kim Novak. And in fact, it's the same character. So I just basically miswatched, I guess, if you want to call it that, Vertigo, the first and only time I'd seen it. So it was incredible to watch it now, and the 4K just looks unreal. So yeah, I would highly recommend this set, this sort of book experience, if anybody is looking to dive into some of Hitchcock's most famous works. And I'm definitely looking forward to revisiting Rear Window, and it's been decades since I've seen Psycho, so I need to rewatch some of these things. But like, it kind of threw me for a loop, Jacob, the idea that I watched a movie wrong and like have been living my whole life since that moment thinking that I knew what was going on, because now I'm like, if I misunderstood Vertigo on such a profound level, what other things have I misunderstood in my life? So
I think we're all guilty of having watched a movie wrong in the past. So I can't think of it off the top of my head. I've been struggling, but I guarantee you there are movies I watched a decade ago and misunderstood something, and it affected how I took the movie. My opinion on films have changed. Like, there are movies I used to love, now I hate, and now I used to hate, now I love. So it happens. So something Vertigo isn't quite as extreme in that way for you, but I think we're all guilty of it. I think we've all have at least one movie in our background, whether we remember or not, where we just missed something really important.
Yeah, it was just it brought it into stark relief for me rewatching this, especially because the clarity of the image in this 4K is just so amazing. So anyway, check that out if you're interested. I also caught up with Steve McQueen's new movie. It's called Blitz, and that's streaming on Apple TV Plus right now. Have you seen this one yet, Jacob?
No, this is one of those things that it's went straight to Apple TV. It's went straight to streaming, right? Like, didn't even get theatrical, right?
If it did get a theatrical release, it was very, very limited.
I am profoundly pro Apple in terms of their TV library, but I feel like they're more guilty than Netflix of just burying movies. Like, a new Steve McQueen movie should be a huge effing deal, and I didn't even know it existed until very recently. So that feels like, I don't know, man. We always dunk on Netflix for doing this. So even though I think Apple has a stronger track record in terms of quality, we got to dunk on Apple for burying this.
Yeah, definitely. I will say I didn't love Blitz nearly as much as I thought I was going to. I really wanted to like this movie. Saoirse Ronan stars in it. She plays first of all, for people who don't know, the movie is set during World War II in London during the Blitz, the bombing campaign that Germany sort of perpetrated on the city of London, and folks are turning off their lights, and it's about the city trying to come together and survive this horrific attack that's going on, the sustained attack. And the plot of the film is about a mother and son who get separated, like basically London, and I don't know if it was like an edict sent down by the government or something, but like the city basically was like, hey, all you parents, if you have kids, you got to get them out of out of town and send them, out into the country, because to these like places that will take care of them, because it's too dangerous for them to be here right now, because we're undergoing the sustained bombing campaign. So Saoirse Ronan regrettably sends her young son away. He's like 10 years old or 8 years old or something like that. And the kid is basically like bullied, and he does not like being on his own that way and wants to reunite with his mom. So he jumps off of the train and tries to get back to her in the city. And it's this sort of like Dickensian story of this kid going on these like almost vignette type of adventures or misadventures of trying to make his way back to his mom. And you get a little bit of Saoirse Ronan in the movie, not nearly as much as I would have liked. You understand, like, she realizes that the kid has gone missing, and so she spends a lot of the runtime like out frantically looking for him. And I just feel like there's so much potential here, and the end result was like pretty disappointing to me, because I did not feel like, with all of the stuff that I just said, I feel like I should be bawling by the end of this movie. It just feels like there's so much power in the emotionality that could be executed really well. And for me, it just, I like the movie ended, and I was just kind of like, huh, well, that was a movie, I guess. And it just doesn't feel like a Steve McQueen movie either. It feels like almost anyone could have made this. So yeah, it's kind of a weirdly anonymous attempt for a director who has such a strong viewpoint for most of his other directorial efforts. So I was disappointed by Blitz, but it's streaming on Apple TV Plus right now, and I know some people have like really connected with it, but I just like, I don't know, it missed me on the emotional level, so didn't really work for me, unfortunately.
I think I will not be prioritizing this in my rush to get ready for our end of the year coverage.
Yeah, I don't think you need to. One that you probably should prioritize though is Nickel Boys. Have you seen this one yet?
No, but you're now the third person to tell me that this movie's great, and I have no idea how I'm going to watch it.
Yeah, so luckily I got a screener, but I think it's going to be coming out on in theaters on December 13th, like a limited release, and then it's going to be like slowly rolling out, over the Christmas frame, and then I think into early January, maybe like a wider release that way. But this is like an Amazon MGM movie, and it's directed by somebody named Ramel Ross, who I was not familiar with at all. I think he had worked in the documentary space before this. And it follows these two black boys who are teenagers, and they're sent to this reform school in Florida in the 1960s. Chris talked about this movie on a previous episode of this podcast, so I'm not going to go too deep on it, but he really loved it and was like really knocked out by it. And I also was very moved by what was going on here. The reform school that they get sent to, I mean, it's generous to refer to it as a reform school. It's basically like a torture palace or something. It's this place where these kids are just completely abused, and occasionally even killed. And it's based on a real place or a series of real places. Like these types of schools were scattered all throughout the country. And this is like 1960s Jim Crow South kind of stuff. And it's a really, really beautiful movie. The aesthetic choices that are made are really what sort of sets it over the top, I think, because most of the movie is told from the like a first person point of view of two characters. So half of the movie is one character and the other half is the other. It's not exactly split in half like that. Occasionally they'll switch back and forth, but man, just a really, really powerful, moving story. So that's a Nickel Boys. I don't want to say too much more about it, but definitely seek that out if you're interested in watching like really great stuff before the end of the year.
Yeah, I will say this is a how sausage is made moment for our listeners. But like we would love to run our best of the year coverage in January. But if we do that, nobody reads it. Like, we would love to be able to wait till every single person on staff has seen everything we want to see. But it's just not viable. Like, as a business, is that we need to run our best of the year stuff before Christmas. So sometimes we miss out on seeing stuff that's really important to us, like Nickel Boys, or like a movie you're about to talk about in a second that I'm very, very upset that I won't be able to see before we have our proper end of year lists made.
Yeah, so the next one is Sing Sing, and I like this one even more, I think. This is just an incredible movie that A24 released earlier this year. They put it in theaters for like a really limited run, and I just saw this morning that they're going to be putting it back in theaters in January, I think. But I feel like they kind of bungled this one because I just really wanted to see this earlier in the year, and it only played in such a small number of theaters that I actually don't think it's streaming right now. So there's just no way for a lot of people to watch this one. But definitely put it on your radar because Coleman Domingo stars in this, and it is like maybe the best work that he's ever done, which I think is saying something considering he's given some really, really strong performances, especially in the past 5 years or so. But the premise of this one is it's set in Sing Sing penitentiary or whatever, and it is about a guy who uh, basically like um, a an inmate who is a part of this rehabilitation through the arts program where they all these incarcerated men get together and put on these stage shows for their fellow inmates, and they have like complete control over the shows that they do and stuff like that. And it's about these guys coming up with this brand new original stage show that they're going to do for their fellow inmates. And it's about this sort of newer member of this group, this kind of like hard scrabble sort of like tough guy being integrated into the acting troupe basically, and sort of coming to terms with the this other sort of softer side of himself, and the performer artist side of himself, and finding value in that, and finding value in the community of these men that come together to put on these shows. And it's just a really, really powerful movie. And the maybe the most amazing part of it is that Coleman Domingo is like one of the only professional actors in it. Everybody else, pretty much everybody else in the movie, are actually formerly incarcerated men who were alumni of this program in real life. So it's really jaw dropping to see these guys who you've never seen before deliver such incredible performances alongside somebody like Coleman Domingo, and really like holding their own, especially Clarence Macklin, who is the main sort of this new guy integrating into this world. And I think he is rightly being talked about in Oscar conversations and stuff like that. So yeah, Sing Sing is a really, really special movie, and I loved it. So I definitely encourage people to seek this one out. Jacob, you're not going to be able to see this one before we put all of our lists together.
Yeah, so Sing Sing and the one you're talking about next. And I'm very interested in Sing Sing, but Ben, I am actively angry that I won't be able to talk about Nosferatu until after Christmas.
Oh man, yeah, that's such a bummer because you're gonna love this. I think it's yeah. Chris talked about this one recently too, so I won't go too long in that. But Bill Skarsgård plays Nosferatu. It's a remake of the 1922 movie, very very similar to Bram Stoker's Dracula. And my God, like Robert Eggers, the director of this, who did what did he do? The Witch and The Lighthouse and movies like that recently.
Northman,
And
like,
Northman, yes.
something he's four for four because all these movies are great.
Yeah, and this one, like, it is a true. There are not many movies this year that I saw that I would call works of art that like inspired me to refer to them as works of art. But Nosferatu inspires that level of praise, I think, where it just like everything feels so incredibly composed and put together, and it's just an amazing movie. I mean, story wise, it's very familiar, so there are going to be almost no surprises for anyone who has seen any other adaptation of Dracula or anything. But Lily Rose Depp, who I was not really, I mean, I've been loosely aware of her, but I've not really fallen in love with anything that she's done. She is incredible in this. Bill Skarsgård is totally unrecognizable as Nosferatu. I thought all of the performances were great. Willem Dafoe pops up in a supporting role, super fun, just like feels perfectly cast. And Robert Eggers, man, he's just firing on absolutely every cylinder that he has. He's just like going all out. And man, this thing is really great. Interestingly, Chris was talking about it, and he was saying like this was one of the only horror movies recently that like really got under his skin and like truly scared him. And I did not have that experience with it. I was not like genuinely frightened by this movie in the way that he was, which is just interesting. I mean, it's like everybody reacts to this stuff differently, but my God, like what an incredible piece of work. So Yeah, this is an amazing movie, and it comes out on Christmas Day, I think. So, absolutely put this one on your radar if you're even remotely into horror or like gothic storytelling. This is, I would say, a must watch for 2024.
Man, I'm. It's all say a deep sigh.
I'm sorry, Jacob. I'm really rubbing salt in the wound
No,
there.
no, I mean, it is one of those things where I know this is very likely a top 10 movie for me. And based on your reaction and BJ's reaction and Chris's reaction, this will make our overall site list for sure. I just wish I was around to have my say because, oh, I've yet to dislike Robert Eggers' movie. Nosferatu and Dracula is very much some of my favorite things ever. So I am
Hmm.
just deep sigh, deep sigh.
Yeah, I feel you. I'm not going to be able to see The Brutalist, I think, until it comes out, and I'm just like desperate to see that one. So that one may not get representation for me in terms of our lists and stuff if I'm not able to see it before then. So I definitely feel you. All right, why don't you tell me what you've been watching recently?
Yeah, I'll have a few things I want to talk about this week. Shrinking, the Apple TV Plus show from Bill Lawrence, who did Scrubs and Cougar Town, the first season of Ted Lasso. So many people told me to watch this, and I kept on putting it off, and I finally watched it, and they were right. Shrinking is really lovely and really funny. I'm only a little deep into season one so far. I still have all of rest of season one and season two, which dropped, which has been dropping later this year or late this year rather. And it's Ben, have you seen Shrinking at all?
So I have heard the same thing that this was a really great show, and my wife and I tried to watch the first episode and got like 15 minutes in, and we are like, "My God, this is really bad," and we just turned it off, which we almost never do. But it was just not clicking with us in that moment for whatever reason. So,
Oh
do you think
man,
it's worth going back?
if you reacted that hard to the first episode, then probably not.
Okay.
Yeah, so probably not. But I think Jason Segel is doing really good work here, and I love Harrison Ford being asked to become a completely different mode than he normally is. But yeah, if the first episode doesn't win you over, then I don't think the rest of the show will either. But man, I'm actually really surprised. My wife thinks that the Shrinking pilot is one of the best pilots ever made. So I'm kind of
Wow.
yeah.
Okay, man. Well, I mean, to be clear, I did not give it a full shake. We didn't even get halfway into the episode, so maybe things could have changed. But yeah, go on. Tell me about it.
I don't know what else to say. I just feel that it has a really good mixture of like real dramatic depth and comedy, and I think that it's messy in ways that I really appreciate. And like I'll compare to the first season of Ted Lasso, which Bill Lawrence also did. Before Ted Lasso went off the rails, it was a show that was about what it means to be decent in a world that wants to beat the shit out of you. And I think
Hmm.
that Shrinking is about that in a messier, darker way. So I do think that people who really were won over by season one of Ted Lasso, and I remain a Ted Lasso season one massive fan, will find a lot of that show's ideas deeply alive in Shrinking.
Okay, excellent. All right, so Shrinking is on Apple TV Plus if people want to check that out. And then you caught up with Gladiator II, right?
Yeah, I've been away from the theaters for a few weeks. Work's been busy and my life's been nuts. So I had to choose between Gladiator 2 and Wicked. And based on everyone I've talked to, I made the wrong choice. Gladiator 2 was fine, maybe. So I think some people actively dislike it. Uh, I guess I know we talked about Gladiator 2 on this show already, so I won't linger on it too much. But I just think about Gladiator 1. Russell Crowe's Maximus spends most of that movie a prisoner, most of that movie locked up or fighting for his life against his will. And yet the movie always feels like Maximus is in control of the storyline. It always constantly feels like Maximus is the one driving things forward at all times. And that character on the page means nothing. Maximus is one-dimensional in that script, but Russell Crowe brings him like this startling sort of life, like with single glances and smirks and like just glances and glares. You understand who Maximus is in a way where the movie just revolves around him in a way that feels powerful and unique. Whereas Gladiator 2 is built around Lucius, a character, and bless Paul Mescal, who's doing all he can, a character who's so inactive and so detached from the narrative that you realize, oh, this guy's a prisoner for this entire movie, and he does nothing. Like the movie is just kind of flowing around him. He's not driving anything. It's such a boring character, and every time Denzel Washington is on screen, is the flamboyant slave master who's pulling the strings. Like, back to him, please, because at least he's driving something. He has plans and goals. And Gladiator 2's script just sinks Paul Mescal and Lucius, the character, in such a profound way. It may be one of the, for a movie as gigantic and well directed as Gladiator 2 is, because Ridley Scott, always has a visual eye. He's never going to turn a movie that looks bad or feels small. But this script was not ready for prime time. This script lets everybody down, and I can't believe that took them 20 years to make Gladiator 2, and this is what they shot. It's really
Yeah. Yeah, that's the biggest tragedy of it, is that it took that long, and it feels like they just started working on the script like a year ago instead of, whatever, developing it slowly over time and like actually delivering it when it was ready. So, yeah, I'm just as bummed as you are about Gladiator 2. So, that's still in theaters. People want to catch up with that. And then, what's the last thing you want to talk about, Jacob?
Right. Well, after I finished reading Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, I decided to check out the BBC miniseries adaptation of the book from 2015. And it's directed by Toby Haynes, who's actually a director I've increasingly learned to love, because he directed roughly half of Andor, the Star Wars series. He directed some really standout episodes of Black Mirror. He directed some really excellent Doctor Who episodes. He's just one of those great TV directors. Like he shows up and his episodes are clearly superior when laid side by side against other people's episodes in the same show. He has that knack to him, and he's actually directing the new Star Trek movie for Paramount. So I hope that works out for him, because I think he's legitimately a really interesting filmmaker. This is a 7-episode BBC miniseries, and it has that. It looks like a BBC show in that they clearly spent money on it. It looks like a well-made Dickens adaptation, or a late era Doctor Who episode in terms of its budget. It looks good. It does. It looks. You can occasionally see the UK TV fringes here and there, but it largely is a high quality production. There's nothing in here is embarrassing or hard to watch in terms of visuals. But it kind of exposes the issue with adapting a book like this, where earlier I described it being a 1,000-page book with 300 pages of plot, and this miniseries does a really fantastic job of adapting the plot. Like, the actual beat after beat after beat of the book is captured really accurately here, and when it does stray from the book, it does it in a way that makes sense to play better in a visual medium. If you want to know what happens plot wise in this book, and you don't want to read it, this miniseries will tell you. And if you just want to see the characters recreated on screen, casting is really good. Eddie Marzan, an actor who is normally playing supporting characters in much larger movies, plays a lead here. I love him, and he's great. But like I said, this was a book about living in the world and experiencing the vibes of it, and getting lost in the language and the history of this world. And this series just doesn't have the capacity to capture that. This is a book that was so happy to be a book. It's meant to be read or listened to if you do an audiobook. And you want to get lost in that language. You want to get lost in how it's being told to you. And this is a very, very good miniseries. And I'll not begrudge anybody who wants to watch this instead of read the book. But as much as I liked it, it just can't capture what I felt was truly magical about the experience of the book, compared to just being a really good recap of the plot, which is the least important part of the book.
So where did you watch this?
It's currently streaming on Amazon Prime, at least in the United States. But I didn't check if it's anywhere else. But if you have Prime, that's where I found it. But I think it's pretty readily available through other services as well if you poke around.
Okay. All right. So that's the Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell miniseries. So I guess your primary recommendation is read the book, but if you're not going to do that, then just watch the show. Does that sum it up?
If you are never going to read the book, the show is very, very good and will let you know what happens in the book. But if you are a reader and you want to know why people are obsessed with this book, including myself, I don't think the show captures why I was obsessed with the book.
Okay. All All right, excellent. Well, I think that's going to bring us to the end of today's episode. You can find more about a lot of the stuff that we talked about at slashfilm.com. Slash Film Daily is published every weekday, bringing the most exciting news from the world of movies and TV, as well as deeper dives into the great features you could find on the site. You can subscribe to the show on Apple, Overcast, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. Send your feedback, questions, comments, concerns, and mailbag topics to us at bpearson@slashfilm.com. Make sure to leave your name and general geographic location in case we mention your email on the air. Don't forget to take a minute to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That really helps us out a lot. Tell your friends about the show any way you can. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll